Let me introduce myself first. My name is Gabriel Dusil. I am the Chief Marketing and Corporate Strategy Officer at Visual Unity. And what we'd like to present to you today is a presentation called Turning Internet Threats into Entertainment Opportunities. We'd like to talk about the over-the-top market, how entertainment has affected the internet, and how the internet has affected entertainment over the past 20 years. So let's begin. To start off with, we like to look at it from the standpoint of when really the internet began. The first 20 years rather of the internet, we were really focusing on connecting people to the internet, connecting data to the internet, and having expansion of website presence as well as e-commerce presence. And it was really all about connectivity. As we moved into the digital society of this decade, beginning around the middle of the last decade, around 2005, we started to have an explosion of video. And what that basically meant was a burden on the internet in terms of the amount of information that was being sent. Cisco, for example, estimates that around 2016, we'll be transmitting about 100 exabytes of data, and 70% of that will be video. And to put that into perspective, that's around 11 billion HD movies sent over 1 year. We're also focusing on this decade from an entertainment perspective. It's about connecting televisions, connecting multi-screens such as laptops, tablets, and mobile phones, and having access to any of these multi-screens at the tip of our fingers. So by 2016, Informa estimates that there'll be about 1.8 billion televisions that are internet connected. And finally, it's really not just about connecting people, it's now connecting devices. We're expecting by 2016, according to ARM, 30 billion devices will be connected to the internet. So it's not just about connecting people, and it's now connecting just about any device that we can think of to this global infrastructure. So what does this mean in terms of the industry wars that I'd like to present to you here? The industry wars that I'm talking about, the entertainment industry, the communication industry, and the computing industry. There is really kind of a battle of supremacy, of client ownership, subscriber ownership, and having a sense of relevance to the future of these industries as they move forward, as each is starting to play in the other's camp. Let's step back and look at these three industries from the standpoint of evolving consumption of entertainment. When we first were consuming entertainment, in the middle of the last century, it was about radio, and it was about viewing that entertainment that was being broadcasted to us. As we move into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we moved into an ownership approach to consumption. From an audio perspective, it was about vinyl, it was about cassette tapes, and then that moved into CDs. From a video perspective, it was from VHS tapes to DVDs to Blu-ray. Essentially, we moved into a market where we have millions and millions of copies of this content sitting on physical media with different consumers around the world. In the 90s, as the internet started to become popular, we started to realize that we can actually have a backup copy of all this content. So we started to move a lot of that content onto our PCs. In the last decade, we started to come up with this idea that we can now move all of that information, all of that entertainment that was sitting in our hard drives, and put it into the cloud. If we assume that our hard drives are not particularly reliable, and we work off the assumption that cloud computing is reliable and redundant and so on, an opportunity to move our entertainment into the cloud, have it safer, and if anything does happen to our local PCs, then we can have a backup copy in the cloud. But the same scenario still applies, that we have millions and millions of copies of this content sitting in the cloud for different users. But once it's in the cloud, we actually have this opportunity in this licensing model now to have a single instance of our entertainment. We no longer have to have our own copy of entertainment, movies, and music, and TV shows. We can have a single instance of that content sitting in the cloud, and we just have a license which allows us access to that content. From this perspective, we can save a lot in terms of storage costs if we just have a single instance of that entertainment in the cloud that we can access at any given time on any device that we want, anywhere around the world. Coming back to the entertainment industry, the computing industry, and communications, we can still look at it in this consumption of entertainment, because in the beginning of entertainment, the entertainment industry had ownership of the consumer. Then as we started to have ownership of that content on physical media and onto our PCs, the computing industry started to take over ownership. And then as we move into the cloud, then we can see communication industry is taking ownership, and you can see how this ownership is really being passed from one industry to another as we move into the future. One of the battles that I'd like to talk about within this industry war is the battle between broadcast and over the top. So broadcast, having this direct connection to televisions, different channels, and using a set-top box, for example, in a pay TV scenario to send channels to our television, we're moving into a scenario where we're completely bypassing that broadcast infrastructure and consuming that content using the internet. Now we're using a router, we're using an internet service provider, and over the top is just a classic definition of completely bypassing the broadcast services in order to consume entertainment. And it's not just about accessing and viewing that entertainment on the television, it's about using the PC, the tablet, and the mobile as additional multi-screens now that we're using the internet as a delivery mechanism. The broadcast industry can potentially see over-the-top services as a threat, but at the same time, broadcast can see the opportunity of over-the-top as an opportunity as well. Once we move into a scenario where we're actually using over-the-top services, we're migrating our viewing habits from classical channel hopping using our remote control to using the internet search capabilities in order to find what we're looking for, and having the ability to have recommendation engines which are much more sophisticated in comparison to the electronic programming guide that we are accustomed to on the television. Finding long tail content that has long passed in terms of popularity is coming back as an opportunity once we move into an internet-based perspective. The other thing that's happening here is we're moving from the need to buy all the books in a bookstore, for example, all the channels that are bundled together in the broadcast services, and we're moving to a buying habit where subscribers are just buying, or borrowing in this case, what they want to consume and nothing more. So this a la carte approach to consuming entertainment, from the purchasing approach to buying the whole bookstore just to get a few books, to a library scenario where we're just getting the books that we'd like to consume, is a change in behavior that we're seeing. It's leading to a scenario where some consumers, in this case around 15%, are reducing their spending of broadcast services, or in some cases completely eliminating their paid TV service in place of using the internet as a delivery mechanism for their entertainment. And we can look at it from the perspective of why they're doing this as well, and the top reasons that we have are in saving money. Some of them are just not even watching enough television in order to justify the higher costs of pay TV. Others are realizing that they're only using the internet for consuming entertainment, so why should they also have their television? And finally, some just feel that television doesn't have suitable packages for them in comparison to the choices that they have on an internet basis. Another battle that I'd like to talk about here is in the battle between the ISPs and the OTT providers. The battle is occurring because ISPs had tremendous success in increasing their subscriber base and so on. But around 2005, when YouTube started to launch and we started to have enough bandwidth to deliver video, OTT providers started to come on to the market as well. This explosion of video increased subscribers' internet usage that is 5 times to 10 times higher than they were utilizing before. So ISPs are sitting there realizing that there's this explosion of bandwidth, and they're struggling to upgrade their backbone in order to keep up with that demand, but realizing they're not having this revenue coming in order to justify that additional capital costs of upgrading their backend. In Europe, there is around 13 gigabytes of data transferred per subscriber. North America, having quite a large installment base of Netflix and Hulu and other OTT services, including YouTube, have an average utilization of 45 gigabytes per month. So really we're looking at 3 times higher than Europe, which doesn't really have an established OTT service. Furthermore, Netflix HD users have a utilization of about 80 gigabytes per month, which is double the average North American user. And we can also look at it from the standpoint of the top 1%, which are topping at 160 gigabytes per month or even higher. So you can see that in markets where there are strong OTT services, it's really the OTT providers that are making the money here. The ISPs are the ones that have the burden to upgrade the backbone in order to keep up with that demand, but aren't seeing the return on investment from a linear perspective. If we look at this from an opportunity, we can take it from the standpoint of the amount of users across Europe. There are close to 500 million users in Europe, about a 61% market penetration, that are on average using 13 gigabytes per month. If we start to introduce OTT services in these markets, we can see that there will be an explosion of opportunity. North America, for example, has already exceeded 70% market penetration. This is another slide that kind of hones in on the specific opportunities that we're talking about. And it's really comparing the US versus EU in terms of internet usage. There's a huge opportunity that's being missed in the European markets. And because of the absence of a strong OTT service, users are utilizing more the YouTube and utilizing more BitTorrent in order to consume their entertainment. In fact, there are several studies that talk about the decline of peer-to-peer networking in the US as OTT services become more popular in that local market. So as we see an increase in video usage across the internet, we're starting to have this third battle between net neutrality and internet governance. What's happening here is those that are promoting net neutrality are saying we don't want anybody to control the internet. We want the internet to be free and open as it has been for the last 30 years. But those that are under internet governance are saying we need to have much more control over what's actually being sent so that we can bring back that control to our industry. And if 70% of internet traffic is video and a portion of that is peer-to-peer networking, then there is a strong motivation to have much more control over what's being sent and how it's being delivered. Internet governance is leading to issues such as data discrimination, where an ISP says, well, I'm going to block peer-to-peer traffic or put it as a low priority. I'm going to put a premium rate on video, for example. I'm going to traffic shape the information that's being sent and as it goes to another service provider. And we're also already seeing in some countries, for example, bandwidth caps in order to prevent a large epidemic of video transfer on the internet. The fourth battle that I want to talk about is really between the mobility side and applications. And mobility here is the communication industry and applications is the computing industry. When we started out with mobility in the 90s, the mobile provider, the operator, had ownership of the phone, had ownership of the infrastructure, and basically had around 3 applications in order to deliver these services. And as we move into today's environment, it's no longer about these 3 applications, it's about the other million applications that we can access. And we're moving from this mobile telephony approach to communications to a mobile lifestyle. Operators, for example, are losing control over the ownership of their subscribers because they no longer have control over the phones and they no longer have control over the applications which are downloadable on the internet, but they still own the infrastructure. The actual value in the phone itself is now diminished in place of the ability to access millions of applications on these smartphones. Again, we come back to this message that I've been coming to over and over again in this loss of control of the subscriber and finding ways to bring back control to their industry. We cannot, of course, ignore this copyright infringement issue when we're talking about the battles between the industries. And this is a study from Envisional which talked about the amount of traffic over the internet that's actually being pirated. And we can see that from their study, around a quarter of what's being transmitted over the internet is actually copyright infringed content. Even though it's BitTorrent or cyberlockers or other types of peer-to-peer networking, this study determined that over 99% of the data that is being sent over these peer-to-peer networks is actually copyright infringed content. And we can dig deeper into the analysis by looking at specifically the BitTorrent aspect of this study, and we can see the distribution of pirated content. A third of it is in films, movies, and also there's a portion of it in televisions, gaming, software, music, but the biggest is in the copyright infringement of films. One of the first generation of peer-to-peer networks was Napster, and it was mainly used for the distribution of music in the late 90s. And by the time they were shut down around the beginning of 2001, they reached 26 million users. As we move into the last decade, the replacement to Napster, which was now viewed as the second generation of peer-to-peer networking, Kazaa, peaked at 34 million users. The difference really between Kazaa and Napster is that Napster had a client-server approach to peer-to-peer networking. So when the Napster servers were shut down, basically everybody was disconnected. Kazaa had a user-based approach, a membership approach to peer-to-peer networking, which removed basically these central servers. So there was really no central server to shut down. And around 2003, the Record Industry Association of America announced that they will begin suing individuals for copyright infringement. In total, around 20,000 people were actually sued, but because of that threat, there was a steady decline in Kazaa users. Eventually, the network shut down around the end of last decade. Mega Upload maxed at 180 million users. These are cyberlockers, basically where you have a membership to download from their servers. They eventually rose to 25 petabytes of data by the time they shut down. That brings us to the third generation of peer-to-peer networking, which is BitTorrent. And BitTorrent is still active today. January 2012, they announced 150 million active users, growing at 50% per year. The difference between BitTorrent and Kazaa is that Kazaa, you had to be part of the network in order to communicate in a peer-to-peer network. BitTorrent took a file-based approach rather than a user-based approach in terms of networking, where the file created the network itself, not the user. And that was really the sea change difference between Kazaa, second generation of peer-to-peer networking, and BitTorrent as the third generation and the current generation. So what are some of the motivations to better understand the copyright infringement that's happening on a global basis? One of the things that's quite clear is that the internet has a borderless approach to communications, and this borderless approach also applies, for example, in this entertainment industry. But if we look at it from the release window of premium content, we could look at premium content from the standpoint of movies, for example, movies that are being released in the cinema. And this is a timeline where a cinema release in the US then leads around 4 months later to a DVD or a Blu-ray release. Around 1 month after that, consumers can rent that content, or then a month after that have access to it on pay TV. Typically around 2 years after the movie release is broadcasted on television. This is, of course, a generalization. Every title has a different timeline, but it gives a different perspective of how premium titles are released into the consumer market. When it's first released in the cinemas, that's when most of the revenue is coming in. We can call that the head-end content. As the timeline progresses, then there is an exponential decay in terms of value of that content as we move into the long tail. One of the points that I'd like to make here is that as we move into looking at premium content from an international release, we have a delay in terms of how international markets are accessing that content. Some titles, for example, have a simultaneous release on an international basis, but other titles could take 6 months or longer to reach an international market, and some titles, for example, don't even reach international markets at all. So what can happen is that the US may have a DVD or a Blu-ray release of a title at the same time that is being released in theaters. International markets are having this delay in terms of consuming content, having accessibility to that content. But because of the borderless internet, we have enthusiasts and users that are seeing this content available on peer-to-peer networks, not even released in the theaters yet in their local market, but they have at their fingertips the ability to access that content on a peer-to-peer network, for example. So rather than wait for the possibility of that content to be released in their local market, they choose to access it through a peer-to-peer network. Now, this is not by any means a justification to stealing that content. We're just merely pointing out some of the motivations that apply in terms of why an international market may be accessing this content. We can look at this in more detail in terms of the frustrations that users that are accessing it from an illegal perspective. Users that actually are stealing the content, they have issues in terms of quality, corrupted files, there could be incomplete bundles. Typically, the user won't have access to behind the scenes and extra type of footage that would be available on a Blu-ray or a DVD. Content management is also a major issue because the content is being downloaded from peer-to-peer networks. There's a large management burden of that content on their local computers, and that can become costly as well. There's ongoing security issues of malware that's being distributed across these peer-to-peer networks. And of course, the major one, which is the fact that it's illegal. But there are also some motivations, and I think it's important for us to understand the motivations of why they're doing this beyond the release windows that I talked about earlier. And one of them is, for example, in downloading that content, all of that DRM is typically removed once it's been ripped, and then it has the flexibility of being transcoded and put onto different multi-screens. It also takes away buying content from one platform and having it available to another platform. Now, the other thing to talk about is that there are legal motivations as well, why we would purchase this content legally. And those that are in this camp really focus on the fact that there's an enhanced user experience. When we're using OTT services, we are familiar with the interface. We have an environment where we're being treated on a personal level and an interactive level as these recommendation engines start to know our buying habits and our viewing habits. And we can use social networking, for example, in order to look at how our friends are watching content and so on. This environment is really the compelling reason in order to consume content. Those that are purchasing content legally also have their own frustration. I talked about this in terms of the availability on an international level. An attractive price is an ongoing dynamic in this industry in terms of what is the proper price in terms of purchasing that content versus renting content, and what is that in terms of an attractive price, or subscribing to an OTT service. And we're seeing a lot of variations in terms of what is an attractive subscription price, purchase price, or rental price. These aspects to pricing is still an ongoing issue in the industry. Content upgradability is something that I didn't talk about, but it comes down to the frustrations of those that are consuming content, movies and music and TV shows on a regular basis, and have moved from VHS tapes to DVDs to Blu-ray, have needed to repurchase their favorite movies in a better quality rather than having this software-based approach in computing where we just pay an upgrade path, an upgrade cost in order to buy a better version of that movie. And this content upgradability is still something that the industry hasn't yet addressed. But as we move into cloud computing and over-the-top services, we really have the flexibility to use a cloud-based licensing model to have an upgrade path to consuming entertainment. So coming back to the issues of piracy and copyright infringement, we often blame these peer-to-peer networks in terms of stealing content. Any declines in revenue in these industries are blamed on peer-to-peer networks, but maybe we really should be blaming the internet itself. And we can look at how the internet has affected various industries, such as long-distance calling, which has been significantly affected because of Skype, using the internet in order to communicate, and this has significantly reduced international call revenue. We can also blame the internet on the newspaper and the magazine decline in revenue to using the internet in order to consume our news. Every user is now becoming a journalist because they have a mobile phone and they're recording newsworthy events before any reporter is able to come onto that scene. We can blame the internet on SMS decline in revenue in place of internet data services in order to send text data. And we can blame the internet in terms of the decline in music revenue. But a lot of those in the music industry, for example, are no longer focusing on battling the online market in terms of loss of revenue, but realize that there are several other ways in order to capitalize on revenue opportunities in the music industry, and realizing that YouTube is really a promotion mechanism in order to generate revenue. Now, we can also thank the internet in terms of how the industry has evolved. We still use the post, maybe not for letters anymore, but we still use the postal services for packages and so on. Online shopping has not replaced brick and mortar shopping. The mobile phone hasn't replaced the landline. And social networking has not replaced the requirement for us to communicate amongst our friends and our colleagues. All of these different applications are complementary and have broadened the choice that we have as consumers. The last battle that I'd like to talk about is really between the social networking aspect and the broadcast aspect to consuming entertainment. The first slide I'd like to talk about here is really a study from Forrester that talks about how subscribers are consuming content on the internet today. And one of the biggest areas from this study is talking about how suggestions of videos is one of the main reasons of how users are discovering new types of content. They're reading reviews and ratings of different types of entertainment. They're looking at online forums and blogs and suggestions in terms of music. All of these areas are all looking at an ecosystem where social networking is at the center of us discovering new types of content. When we look at this last battle that's happening between the broadcast industry and the social industry, from an entertainment consumption perspective, we can look at broadcast as central to consuming entertainment, and the social network is a ring around the consumption of broadcast. In this context, the social aspect is really the second screen applications that we're seeing, where we're watching the living room television, but we're using our tablet and our mobile phone in order to Facebook and Twitter and talk about the live broadcast that we're seeing, and we're chatting about it with our friends and so on. The social infrastructure sees it differently, where social interactions are central, but they're getting into the broadcast game as well by broadcasting live sports events and concerts and so on, using Facebook in order to bring broadcast as an additional layer of the consumption of entertainment. And the applications that we have accessible, whether it's the millions of applications that we have on our mobile phones or in our tablets or in the computing environments on our PCs, these applications are basically giving us access to the social networks and the broadcast infrastructures. And this brings us full circle to the three industry battles that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. The entertainment industry is broadcast, communication industry is social networking, for example. The computing industry is where we're talking about OTT content and using all three of these industries as a complementary platform in order to enable over-the-top content communications and over-the-top content consumption. So as we start to wrap up in this presentation, I'd like to talk about some of the evolutions in OTT. And one of the areas that's important is really in content discovery. I talked about this at the beginning of the presentation of how content discovery is really changing our ability to consume content, because it's not just about consuming content that we know about, it's about consuming content that we don't even know exists, but we would like some way to be able to find it and some sort of a platform in order to bring that long tail content or obscure content to us that we would never be able to discover on our own. Really, we need to look at this not as a nice to have feature from an OTT perspective. In fact, actually, it really is a revenue generator. Here, recommendation engines are combining viewing statistics, the chatter that's happening in social media, the buying behavior of that subscriber, looking at the likes and dislikes of that subscriber, the preferences that they have, also combining reviews, professional reviews in the news, also looking at a collaborative view of what other viewers liked that were similar to you, and bringing this and correlating this data for those subscribers so that when they're receiving a recommendation from their OTT engine, they truly believe that the OTT engine knows them well enough to give them recommendations that they truly would enjoy watching. When a subscriber starts to discover content and starts to consume content that they've never discovered before, they're staying in this environment longer and they're spending more money. Another aspect that I'd like to talk about here is the evolution in terms of looking at OTT as not just video. And you can see the top two areas here, social media and communications. This is the communication industry. In terms of video, music, and gaming, this is the entertainment industry. These three areas of entertainment are central to an OTT platform. And in terms of computing, storage, and productivity, OTT is an enabler of productivity and traditional storage capabilities as well. So we can look at OTT as a central platform for three industries of entertainment, communications, and computing. And this is where we believe where OTT is moving into the next decade. We can see that from a big picture perspective, OTT by 2017 will represent 9% of the overall TV and video industry. This is a market that's growing very fast, over 30% per year. It's going to reach $37 billion by 2017, according to Informa. But from a big picture perspective, this is still 9% of the overall TV and broadcast industry. We can look at OTT in terms of how it's evolving from the vertical tiers, and we believe that national broadcasters are the major movers, and realizing that over-the-top content is more of an opportunity than a threat. The second tier are the regional broadcasters, affiliates, and content aggregators, and even the communication providers like telcos and cable TV providers moving into the OTT space as a complementary extension to their existing portfolio. And finally, we can also look at corporations and government and education and other types of enterprises entering into the OTT space because they have, in some cases, a large library of content. They don't want to put it onto a public service, but they want an OTT platform in order to monetize that. Here's a little bit more detailed view of the market opportunity in terms of different types of enterprises that are looking at OTT as an extension of their existing portfolio in terms of communicating their brand presence and so on. Media companies, here sits the broadcasters, theaters, even radio stations. The other opportunity that we talked about is in the network operators in terms of those that are delivering video but also want to get into the OTT space in management and hosting. The final one that I want to talk about here, it's about the evolution of OTT from a geographic perspective. It's fair to say that the US are leading the industry in over-the-top content and really started around 2007, 2008. The European markets, Canada, and some parts of Asia are around 18 to 24 months behind the US. There's a third tier of emerging markets, which is fair to say is around 36 to 48 months behind the US or 18 to 24 months behind Europe. When we're in the emerging markets or in Europe, by looking at what the US is doing today, it can give us a good perspective of what we will be doing in the next 18 months to 24 months and give us an opportunity to potentially leapfrog or do things in parallel to the US markets. The final slide that I want to talk about is really where Visual Unity is coming from. We have a platform called View Media, and View Media is really set up in a modular architecture in terms of the creation of content, ingesting that content into an OTT platform. We have a sub-module that we call View Ingest. Then we have a management section which is quite comprehensive, and it includes a dashboard, client relationship management, content discovery, content protection, and monetization. And then we move into a delivery, which is ViewNet. And then there's the consumption onto multi-screens, and that's our View Multi-Screen service. And this is where we have support for different consoles, social networking, responsive designs, and so on. So if you'd like to have more information, then please let us know or contact me directly, and I can get you in contact with somebody in our organization which would be happy to talk to you about this further.